Welcome to the November 2021 Plant Lovers Tour at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. Chris was absolutely right. We don't have a whole lot of fall foliage color yet. Certainly up in the mountains, things are well colored, but not so much here. It is November 3rd. Not that long ago, we usually would have had a hard frost by the end of October. And now that frost is many weeks later, there are late blooming things that manage to bloom out in full. It also means that some of the deciduous trees and shrubs eventually manage to color up better than they would when frost was in October. If you've gardened in this area for a number of years, you've probably had falls where frost was much earlier and the green leaves on the Japanese maple were killed by the frost, and then you get no fall color at all. And often the leaves aren't even shed, which is a real ugly effect of the dead leaves hanging on to the Japanese maples. So a month from now, we might have a lot of glorious fall color in the garden, but we are not lacking fall color. It's just going to be more floral fall color and fruit as well. So I think you'll be pleased. I'm standing behind this big mass of the chrysanthemum. We have many chrysanthemum selections in the garden. A few of the earliest blooming ones are finishing up. Others are just starting. This one is just starting this week. This is one of our latest ones to bloom. This one is Miss Gloria's Thanksgiving Mum, named by Jenks Farmer of North Augusta, South Carolina, for his mother, Gloria. And it's always dependable bloomer in November. These single mums are highly favored by pollinators. I don't know what you see on the screen, but I see honeybees, some bumblebees, some great big carpenter bees that just look like very large bumblebees. I've seen several skippers. Skippers are the third group of insects. You know, you have butterflies, moths, and skippers. Skippers are the little, very active one when they're at rest, sort of hold their wings upright more so than, well, a moth doesn't. And you'll recognize them when you see them. If you're planting flowers to support pollinators, this time of year it's really important to pay attention to the sun, because the sun is already much lower in the sky than it was back in the summer. It's also traveling a much shorter route across the sky. It's mostly coming from the south, whereas in the peak of summer it starts well to the north and then travels all across the southern sky and, you know, is setting again towards the northwest much more so than in the winter. So some parts of your garden that might have been in full sun in the summer are not in sun now, but so be aware of that when you're deciding where to plant these late bloomers for pollinators, because insects are solar powered and they're not going to visit flowers in shade anywhere near as much as they will flowers out in the sun. These hardy chrysanthemums are real vigorous growers. They do spread some, but that means every few years, if you need to reduce the size of the mass, you'll have plants to share with your neighbors and friends. They're all super good cut flowers. They'll last for weeks in the house, but we really enjoy them for late fall color. These are not the cushion mums that every garden center and grocery store is full of, you know, in late summer and very early fall. A lot of those cushion mums were bred for exactly the product that you buy. It's a little mound of flowers, and many of them don't survive the winter. They weren't necessarily bred for winter hardiness. And the ones that do often try to bloom in the heat of summer and they don't bloom really well. But these sort of old-fashioned type chrysanthemums wait till the fall to bloom, and then they just bloom out and, absolutely covering themselves with flowers. And we'll see quite a few other selections in the garden. I grabbed a stem of this lovely pale yellow one. This is Gethsemane Moonlight. It's just barely starting. Most of the plant was not yet in bloom. And because our time is limited and I want to be alive at the end of this program and not murdered by the cameraman and Chris on the computer, we're not going to run around the entire Arboretum, but just to show you another color that you can get these old mums in. Some of them are fairly fragrant. A big mass down by the rose garden. Visitors yesterday were mentioning how they could smell the fragrance on the air. A lot of these taller ones really benefit from being cut back. The people say July 4th, but you can certainly cut them back once or twice over the summer to keep them shorter, because otherwise they do get tall and flop over. There are a few selections like Sheffield Pink that if you don't cut them back, they're still only going to be under 2 feet tall. But the fact that they get tall also means they have long stems for cutting. I know. We're going to step down here and look at another plant that blooms in the fall. This is actually a marigold, meaning that it's in the same genus as the little annual marigolds. The genus is Tagetes or Tagetes, Tagetes, I believe. But this one is a winter hardy herbaceous perennial. It dies to the ground in the winter. And it doesn't bloom until fall, but then it blooms for an extended period of time. It's also a very worthwhile culinary herb because the foliage smells exactly like tarragon. And tarragon is a cold climate herb that does not persist in our climate, but this Mexican marigold is a perfectly good substitute for tarragon. So beautiful late bloomer, but also a useful plant in the kitchen. And like the chrysanthemum early in the year before it's making flower buds, they're both really easy to root from stem cuttings. I'm sure it's also a really good cut flowers. It's the full scientific name is Tagetes lucida, lucida referring to shiny, I guess because the foliage, well, maybe the flowers too are sort of shiny. But great fragrance. And it's a well-behaved little plant. I will stop off at a plant that's not showing any fall color, but this is a redbud, a cercis. In eastern North America, we only have one species of redbud, Cercis canadensis, referring to Canada, but much more widespread than that. But this is one of, 8 or 10 species of redbud native to China. And this is a species that is only now coming into gardens in the US. It's Cercis chuniana, C-H-U-N, I'm sure is named after somebody with the family name of Chun or Chun. And I'm talking about it now because this got planted almost a year ago, but the plants we had in the nursery in last fall, it developed incredibly bright red foliage in the fall. So we don't know yet if it'll behave the same way when it's growing in the ground, but we're going to keep an eye on it. Bearded iris, of course, are more typically in full bloom in May, maybe June, maybe the earlier ones starting in April. But there's a tremendous amount of breeding going on to produce bearded irises that repeat bloom. So they have not just the bloom in mid-spring, but also repeating bloom. Now, this is one that blooms reliably every fall. The cultivar is again and again because it does bloom repeatedly. And there's two scapes here in bloom, but I see other scapes that aren't, won't bloom for another week or two. And a lot of these fall blooming things will keep on blooming up until a hard frost stops their bloom. I did mention that there are a lot of repeat blooming iris. Not all of them behave the same, and they might have been bred by somebody in another part of the country, like California, and it might be a good cultivar for repeat bloom in California, but maybe it doesn't repeat well here. So before you go through a iris catalog and order everything that repeats bloom, you might talk to somebody who has some experience with them and find out which varieties are reliable repeat bloomers. A couple that are in the nursery trade that are good repeat bloomers are Clarence, which has white standards and blue falls, and Immortality, which is a solid white one. But there is a local chapter of the American Iris Society. They actually bloom here. They actually meet here at the Arboretum about once a month, at least most of the year. And many of those members could tell you which bearded iris repeat bloom reliably. So it's a fun thing. And, nowadays there's so many other plants that have been bred for repeat bloom, like various different azaleas, including some bred by NC State's own plant breeder, Dr. Tom Rainey. We're going to travel a few steps and visit some other blooming plants. In a moment, you'll see this beautiful camellia I'm standing by. There are two species of camellias that have been grown in gardens in the South for a long, long time. The best known one is Camellia japonica, which, despite having japonica as its name, is one of the most widespread species occurring in Japan and Korea and China and probably other countries as well. The other camellia that is has been grown in the South for a long time is Camellia cesanqua. Cesanqua is coming from the Japanese common names. I don't speak Japanese. The common name is something like cesanqua, so very close to cesanqua. And Camellia cesanqua is native only to Japan, but it's a species that's probably cultivated around the world wherever they can be grown. And they're all fall to very early winter blooming plants. And in a moment, we'll see an example of a full-size one. And they're small trees with permanent stems. They don't need renewal pruning or anything like that. And they'll get about 15 feet tall or so. But amongst the many hundreds of Camellia cesanqua cultivars, there are some compact ones. And this is one, Sarrel, Sarrel, which up until last year or two was half the height it is now. And I don't know whether it's decided to change its growth habit, but there are a number of other small growing ones. If you get the local gardening magazine, Triangle Gardener, David Parks of Camellia Forest in Chapel Hill, wrote a very good article on some very compact selections of camellias, not just cesanqua, but other species as well. Camellia japonica is in hot parts of the country, happiest with a little bit of shade during the heat of the day. But cesanqua will bloom well in light shade, but it also can be grown in full sun, and then it really blooms heavily. The color range is white, pink through near red, sort of very, very dark pink. Well, no, I guess there's a few true red ones like Yuletide, which is really popular, single red one that's late blooming. And that's another thing. When we typically had hard frost by the end of October, the late fall blooming cesanquas, like Yuletide, often didn't bloom well at all. But now that we often escape a really hard frost until well into November or even later, the late ones are making, giving a good show as well. I think they're might be the prettiest of flowering shrubs in the fall. And this is a very full double one, but the single ones I think are especially pretty. They look like butterflies on the plant. Or we'll take a few steps up here to look at another one, mostly just to give you the sense of how big a cesanqua can get if it's a full-size growing one. I'm standing in front of this Camellia cesanqua. It's a cultivar Hiryu, Hiryu, which I suspect is a Japanese cultivar name. It's one of the earliest ones to start blooming. And I still see a lot of unopened buds. So these are not shrubs that bloom for 2 weeks and then they're done. They might bloom for most of a month or so. And it's more of a, I guess it wouldn't be considered a true single, but it is an open-centered, it might be considered a semi-double. They are open-centered, and you see the pretty golden stamens. And it's sort of a purple, but some years, and this is one of them, it's showing a fair amount of blue as well, which is an interesting aspect. So, what's that? What's the name again? Hiryu, Hiryu. But this shows you, this is about as tall as cesanqua can get. Now with time, this will get wider than it is. But as I mentioned, remember what I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are compact selections. There are also some, quite more than a few very tightly columnar selections. And we might pass by one that I'll point out as we run around the Arboretum. Okay. Camellia, people often overemphasize the fact that camellias want acid soil. Well, they don't need acid soils in the way that, a blueberry does, where it needs to be real acid. They're just like so many plants we grow. They want a soil they don't have to have a strongly acid soil, just, 6.5, which is lightly acid, would suit them just fine. They're much happier with a slightly acid soil than an alkaline soil, but you're not going to hurt them with lime if your soil is like 5.5. If you made it a little less acid, they'll probably be even happier than if it was strongly acid. The cesanquas do have a fragrance. I know when I led a tour yesterday, one of the people in attendance said she loves the fragrance, and noses are different. It's not a fragrance I like all that much, but it is one of those very seasonal smells. All right, we're going to travel a few steps and visit some beautyberries. I'm standing in front of a plant of Calico Americana, Welch's pink. Now, people are often afraid of the scientific names of plants, but Calicarpa is from Greek, kalos meaning beauty, and carpa meaning fruit. So it's a case where the scientific name is exactly like, is identical to the common name, beautyberry, Calicarpa. As you might guess, Calico Americana is an American native. And this is the typical color of not only Americana, but most Calicarpa, much darker color than this Welch's pink. But some of the species are also available in a white form. All three of these are Calico Americana. This is the typical color, though this particular stem came off a variegated selection where the foliage is variegated. And Welch's pink is a paler one. And then, I always forget whether this, the white form is albophoria fructa or whatever, but it's the white form of Americana. Calicarpa are edible. I ate some yesterday on the tour, and I'm pretty sure I'm still alive. You know, they're not repellent. They're also not exciting. I think if you were into, garnishing your salads or something with colorful things, that'd be fun from that standpoint, because these bright magenta fruit would really sparkle on a fruit. The foliage has also been used as a mosquito repellent, and that's something I learned just recently in doing some research on Calicarpa. And my coworker Tim Alderton says he'll rub the leaves on his skin, and it does seem to repel mosquitoes. So a useful feature. And the reason why I was doing research is because I had, for decades, known, because I was taught that Calicarpa was in the Verbena family, but taxonomists have decided it belongs in the mint family. Now, the mint family is huge and includes not only mint like peppermint and spearmint, but also rosemary and lavender and salvia and so many other genera. But both families, the Verbena family and the mint family, are ones that deer and rabbits tend not to eat. But, whenever I say that, and this happened yesterday, there'll be somebody in the audience to say they eat them in my garden. So I think it might be safe to say they're not the first plant that deer will eat, but they might when they run out of other things to eat. What else do you want to know about beautyberries? One thing that's happening here is the fruit, and it's happening on these white fruit. You see there's a lot of brown fruit, and that might be partly age, but you certainly see it on these pink fruit. If you look at some stems, I'll cut this stem here that's shaded by the upper parts of the plant. It's better color, but out here in the sun, they're bleaching. And so they will thrive in full sun, but if you have a location where they have shade this time of year, the fruit color will stay a good color much longer. They're fun for cutting for flower arrangements. I always pull the rather coarse foliage off. They bloom on new wood, which means there are no flower buds on these plants at this time of year, or where spring blooming shrubs and trees like azaleas and dogwoods already have their flower buds. So if you cut them back now, you're cutting off next spring's flowers. Those plants are described as blooming on old wood, but Calicarpa blooms on new wood. So if you cut it to the ground in the winter, the following year, next year, if I did this today, or a few weeks from now when the fruit disappears, if I cut it to the ground this winter, it's going to flower and fruit next year, so you don't miss out on the seasonal display. And that's a useful thing to know, because if your garden is smaller, you can keep the plant, half the size if you just cut it to the ground in the late in winter or early spring.
We had a couple questions online, Doug, if you're ready for a question or two.
Sure.
Sandy commented that, of course, the Mexican beautyberry seeds around quite a bit in the landscape, which I will definitely agree with. She was wondering, are there any beautyberries that produce fruit yet may not seed around anywhere near as much?
Well, Chris mentioned the Mexican beautyberry, which is in the Americas. There's only a few species of Calicarpa, but in China there are 48 species of Calicarpa, and we don't have 48 different Asian species in the Arboretum, but we probably have, I'm going to guess, 10 to 12 or so, and most of those species we don't have seeding around. So, and we're going to meet some others like Calicarpa rubella. We've had that in the garden, certainly the 4 years I've worked here, and I've not seen any seedlings. So some of the Asian ones don't seed around much. Yeah, there's might be some. Now, Calicarpa dichotoma, which is an Asian species, does seed around a whole lot. Share them with your neighbors. And I might mention, the beautyberries, almost all the species really are a fall display. Mockingbirds and other fruit-eating birds will quickly strip the fruit off some of the beautyberries when they find them. But also many of them the fruit will also shrivel when you have a hard frost. And that's another reason, if you grew it like under a pine tree, just a little bit of protection from the overhead pine will protect the fruit from the early frost. There are other beautiful trees and shrubs with fruit that's starting to color up, like many different hollies, but they're a fall display, but they also continue all winter long. But the calicarpas really are a fall display. Were there other questions, Chris?
There was. I've lost track of it.
Okay. Well,
unfortunately.
We'll continue on.
We did have a question from Ginger, and I'll just answer it via the voice. Ginger asked, cut back in the winter to control the growth, but can you dig up half the plant without harm? It's pretty much one crown, so you don't want to dig up just half the plants. Just cut it back. It's an easy process to do.
Well, I disagree with Chris because I often, not often, but I'm perfectly comfortable with dividing a shrub. It often requires, pruning shears and saws and stuff. But sometimes a shrub that is many years old is starting to sort of break apart into separate plants anyway. So you could reduce them that way. But, just cutting them to the ground is going to keep them quite a bit smaller.
Yeah, and I actually cut mine back to the ground twice a year. I do mine before the growth starts growing in the spring and in early March. And then I cut mine back again in late May or so, just to reduce the height and increase branching. And they're perfectly fine. I've been doing that for 20 plus years.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Chris. I would have been too timid to cut it back the second time.
When it comes to calicarpa, don't be timid.
Yeah. Well, does yours probably flowers and fruits a little bit later?
They're wonderful. They fruit right on time every year. Okay. And it's not a matter of just nipping the tips. I cut the new growth back by half.
Okay. Sometimes the common name and the scientific name of plants are exactly identical. And such is the case with Aster, at least in the past. The genus Aster occurs in Europe, Asia, and many, many species in North America. But in recent years, I believe all of the North American plants that used to be in the genus Aster have been put into a number of new genera, often with long, unpleasant names. And I'm a person who, I've always liked the names and the derivation of names, but we're standing here in front of an Asian species of Aster, and it remains in the genus Aster. This is Aster aggeratoides. It is the cultivar Izo Morisaki. Morisaki is Japanese for purple or violet. I think the wild type is probably a more of a lighter version of this, a lavender color, not this strong purple-violet. There's also a pure white form, which is really lovely. Its name is something like Shiva or something along that line. I meant to look it up before this tour. Now, Aster aggeratoides is a fairly steady spreader. So, don't plant it if you have a teeny tiny garden full of little treasures. But if you have a fair amount of room, it's a good ground cover. The foliage is pleasant all summer long, and the floral display, is probably lasts at least a month at this time of the year. It's a relatively short aster. We generally don't need to cut it back. These haven't been cut back. They have sort of flopped open a little, so maybe a light cutting back in midsummer would have prevented that, but I really enjoy it this time of year. This is a very sunny location. It does fairly well with part-day shade, but you can also overdo shade and then you end up with plants without much flower. Alrighty. The genus Salvia is a very large genus. Some are from very cold parts of the world. Many are tropical ones that we either don't grow at all or we grow as tender perennials, sort of treating them as annuals. But quite a few of them are winter hardy. And a lot of them don't bloom until late in the year. This is one that is fully winter hardy for us, and we've had in the Arboretum for many decades. And it's a Mexican species, Salvia puberula. Puberula referring to the flowers are really hairy. I guess they'll be able to get a close-up and you can see the lips of the flower are real hairy. It'll bloom for many, many weeks, provided a frost doesn't end its display. It is a tall thing. It's, good 6 foot tall, but dying to the ground every winter. It's also a well-behaved salvia. Some salvias spread quickly underground, but this one does not. I'm carrying a stem of another salvia. It's wilting a little bit because I've been visiting with you for half an hour now. But this is another late blooming salvia, another Mexican species, Salvia regla, R-E-G-L-A. And it's a cultivar name, and there's a number of cultivars of it. It's spelled J-A-M-E, not James, but I think it's pronounced Jame, I'm guessing. But it's a woody shrub. In a milder climate area, it also can become a small tree, but it'll get 5-6 feet tall and really showy in bloom this time of year. But being a woody shrub, it maintains stems over the winter and puts out new growth from them. The majority of salvias are sun lovers, but there's some really good fall blooming ones that actually are shade plants. And they're already done blooming, but they were real pretty for most of October, like Salvia koyame and Niponica and Salvia glabrescens. Many of them are yellow flowered and beautiful little fall blooming shade garden plants. October, I know we're now in November, but October is sort of the beginning of the bulb year. And believe it or not, there are fall blooming crocus. There's one at my knee here. There's one at the front of the bed. There's a couple over here. And, though we think of crocus and snowdrops as harbingers of spring, I'm interpreting things now. The bloom season really begins in October and continues all winter. If you selected the right 6 to 8 species of crocus, you could have them blooming from now through the winter months into spring, when the most common of crocus, the big Dutch hybrids, Crocus vernus, blooms. An interesting thing about these fall blooming crocus and snowdrops is they produce a long succession of flowers. There's not just that one flush, but with the fall blooming crocus, there'll be fresh flowers every few days. This is perhaps the most common of the fall blooming crocus, Crocus speciosus, meaning showy. And it's one that you can sometimes even find in garden centers, but you'd also find it in any mail order bulb catalog. There are many other much harder to find Crocus speciosa, but other crocus species that have to be found from specialty nurseries like Odyssey bulbs or something like that. But making a bigger show right now is this hardy cyclamen, Cyclamen heterofolium. Heterofolium referring to the foliage that looks like hetera, hetera being the scientific name for ivy, like English ivy, and you see it's very, very much sort of ivy shaped. Now you might think, these are garden selections with variegated foliage, but even I've never seen a solid green-leafed Cyclamen heterofolium. Any of the wild ones all have some degree of silver mottling in the leaf. There's maybe about 30 different species of cyclamen. The majority can be grown in this area. Some of them are pretty exacting in what growing conditions they would tolerate, but the easiest one, the one to start with, is this species Cyclamen heterofolium. Their peak bloom is October, November, but they'll start to spit and sputter, in August or in September, and then have this big flush of bloom this time of year. Even if they didn't bloom, they'd be worth growing because the foliage, which is only now starting to develop, is just gorgeous all winter long. There's even some seed strains that have solid silver leaves. And this pink color is the typical color, but solid white is also available. And there's some newer seed strains. There's sort of a coral pink one. Corfu Red is the seed strain, the name of the seed strain. And then there's also one that's this impossibly dark sort of purple pink that really is quite beautiful. In this neighborhood is this lovely pelargonium. The florist geraniums, the big, typically scarlet geraniums, are not in the genus geranium, they're close relatives, but are also pelargoniums like this one that's winter hardy. This is an African species, and it's Pelargonium transvalensis, African princess, a selection introduced by Plant Delight's nursery. We enjoy it all through the growing season because of the handsome foliage, which that pretty maroon marking through the leaf. And indeed, the florist geraniums, pelargoniums, are often referred to as zonal geraniums because they typically have that zoning in the leaf. But it doesn't bloom till fall, and quite a charming thing, real airy. Okay. Get up as gracefully as possible. We're going to... Did you say something, Chris?
Doug, we have a whole bunch of people asking about the salvias that you also talked about.
Yeah.
The bonus ones, I think, were better for shade, and I think I was just too busy looking things up and answering questions that whole blew by me. Okay.
So you want the names again?
Sure.
Well, that's what you're asking.
Yep.
Well, that's sure. There's 3 yellow-flowered ones that are very similar. They're sort of variations on a theme. There's Salvia nipponica, Nippon, an old name for Japan. There's Salvia koyame, another Japanese species, Koyamae. And then Salvia glutinosa, which is like this big version of the other 2. And then there's Salvia glabrescens, which is not yellow, but it is either pink or violet. And then there's a new selection that I acquired from Plant Delight's nursery, but it's called something like elk purple yellow, or no, I'm probably messed up the cultivar name, and it is sort of a yellowish flower with purple spots inside. But they're handsome foliage plants through the summer, and then they bloom in late summer and early fall. And, you know, in the shade garden, there's not an overabundance of things that bloom in the fall, so they're really an asset. And being salvias, they're probably less likely to be eaten by deer and rabbits. I know I've gotten everybody excited by saying we're going to look at one of my favorite plants of the season, but since we're standing right here, we're going to look at some of these little treasures right now. This is actually a species of impatiens. Everybody knows the common impatiens walleriana of summer gardens, but this is a winter hardy perennial. It's a Chinese species, Impatiens omeiensis from Mount Ome. And it comes up in the spring, super lush. It takes a vacation in the heat of summer and largely disappears, and then comes up this time of year and blooms. And the flower, you know, the thing about the common Impatiens walleriana, I think it's a kind of boring flower. It's just this flat flower of, you know, 5 flat petals. And so many, the genus Impatiens is huge. Many of them are tropicals. Well, walleriana and the New Guinea Impatiens are tropical, but they thrive in our tropical-like summers. But most other Impatiens have these really exotically shaped flowers. This one sort of reminds me of a cornucopia with the funnel-shaped floral tube and then the little curved tail at the end. So I enjoy looking at them. Imagine, you know, a hummingbird or something might like that flower. And another little autumnal treasure is this fall blooming snowdrop. This is the same genus as the spring snowdrops, the winter blooming snowdrops, Galanthus, but this is Galanthus reginae Olgae. I haven't done this yet today. I actually pulled out a label so you can see the name. Reginae is referring to royalty, to a queen, and Queen Olga, and either of Turkey or Greece. I'm forgetting which, and I should have looked that up since yesterday. But it's one I've grown for many decades, and it just gets, the bulbs multiply freely, and you end up with a bigger and bigger clump, and it benefits from being divided so it can increase even more quickly. But an easy fall blooming bulb. Sometimes it starts in October, some years it waits till November, and so it's just starting. Its main floral display will be this month. And of course, the difference between a snowdrop and a snowflake, snowdrops they both have 6 tepals, and in a snowdrop, the 3 outers are much larger than the 3 inner, but the snowflakes, the leucogyms, they have 6 identical tepals. And I'm using the word tepals and not petals, not because I'm an illiterate, but because botanists use the term tepals when both the sepals and petals are petal-like, which is typical of, you know, the lily family and the amaryllis family. But this is the plant we were heading for. This is a euonymus. You might see the resemblance of the fruit to one of our few North American native euonymus, Euonymus americanus. But the genus Euonymus is really big. And there are many tree-sized ones native to Asia and Europe. But this is an Asian species. Well, I am looking at the label, and I'll pull the label again for you. Euonymus gentianus. The cultivar is Beni Yaku. Beni refers to red. I haven't attempted to figure out what Yaku means. But it's just sort of magical this time of year. The plant is fairly tall, and but not terribly wide, rather open growing. But that means it's able to display these fruit. This fruit has, you know, that's at least 5-inch long stalk that the fruit is borne on. And, you know, the flowers were borne on this same long stalk. And the flowers are not as showy as the fruit, but still, then it looks sort of like this diaphanous sort of sheer curtain with the hanging down flowers. It's really magical. But this time of year, the fruit remind me of little origami creations, maybe like origami cranes or something. It's a typical euonymus fruit in that when the fruit is fully ripe, it opens up and these orange seeds dangle out of the fruit. I would eventually love to plant it outside a window, like maybe the kitchen window, since I spend lots of time in the kitchen, and just be able to look through the plant year round. It is deciduous. I don't remember if the foliage develops much color. So, one of the most commonly cultivated euonymus is Euonymus elatus, the burning bush, which is grown almost solely for the fall color of the foliage. It's, turns a brilliant scarlet red in the fall. But I don't remember about this one, so I'll try to remember to keep closer tabs on it and report back. But despite like the little evergreen euonymus being amongst the easiest of plants to root, a lot of these tree-like euonymus are almost impossible to root. We have a tray of cuttings that still look good, that were stuck many months ago, and no sign of rooting, even with the modern rooting gels that are enabling us to root things that we haven't rooted in the past. But, and some of them are difficult from seed as well. We're going to sow seed. We won't be able to put the cultivar name on, and I don't know if the seedlings will vary much from the parent, but time will tell. But just totally charming this time of year. Didn't think anyone would ever describe a euonymus as totally charming. This is a plant that's been blooming probably since mid to late spring. It's fuchsia. It's a fuchsia selection that was bred for heat tolerance. The wild parents of this type of fuchsia are native to, the very tip of South America, where it might not ever freeze, but it's never hot. And so the common fuchsias aren't thrilled come the heat of summer, but this selection was bred for heat tolerance, and it does thrive. Where is its label? There's a label on one over there. Here's its label. It's one of those modern cultivar names that is totally unpleasant. I can come towards you if you want. What's that? Okay. The cultivar name is Sanahaf. It sounds like a German sanitary product or something like that. And, they get trademark names, which aren't really their cultivar names, of angel earrings cascading. But a case where they bred it for heat tolerance and they succeeded. Now, I see a lot of fruit on the fuchsia. They too are edible. And, they wouldn't be the first thing you would choose if you had better things to eat, but they're fine. I've probably said all I need to say about chrysanthemums, but just to show you some of the diversity. This is one of the few chrysanthemums we grow that is not a daisy form. It's a little button type flower. It's one called Mrs. Robinson. I think it was introduced by the former niche nursery of Chapel Hill. I don't know if the people who bought the nursery are growing any of these great perennial chrysanthemums. And on my other side is another one from niche nursery, Kathy's Rust. A very autumnal color. We have a very similar one without a cultivar name that we just referred to, Single Red, which is a slightly redder, darker version of this. And of course, there's countless pink daisy mums, and some of them are very similar but are worth growing because some of them bloom early and some bloom late, and it's nice to have multiple pink ones that bloom at different times of the mum season. But we're going to head and meet some lovely Asian beautyberries. Kathy's Rust and Mrs. Robinson. The chrysanthemums do best with as much sun as you can afford to give them. Certainly in our climate, that doesn't need to be sun all day, but they are sun lovers. The Arboretum's director, Mark Wethington, often travels to China and other parts of Asia, often in the fall when he can collect seed of many things and or cuttings or occasionally plants. And in this area, we have 3 or 4 different species of Asian Calicarpas, beautyberries, that he brought back from China as seed. This is Calicarpa cathayana. Cathay is an old name for China. The fruit is bleaching a lot in this full sun location, so a good fruiter, but obviously would be making a much better show if it had a little bit of shade on the fruit this time of year. It does develop pretty outrageous fall color. It's just starting, but this will turn sort of fluorescent pink. And these plants this is, I think, their second full growing season, so they're pretty tall already, but I think they'll, left to their own devices, be quite a bit taller. This is another species of beautyberry, Asian beautyberry, and as I mentioned earlier, there are about 48 species in China. And, they occur in other countries in Asia as well, so the 48 doesn't even encompass all of the Asian species. Well, there's a couple species that occur in Japan that might not occur in China. This one hasn't been keyed out yet, but it looks very much like plants we have as Calicarpa formosana. Now, formosana is a scientific name that can either refer to Taiwan, because Taiwan in the past was named Formosa, but Formosa means beautiful, and so both the country and the plants named Formosana might be named such because they are beautiful. I think it has rather handsome foliage, but these lovely big sort of loose clusters of fruit. And these are young plants. I suspect these younger parts of the plant that aren't fruiting would fruit really heavily next year. Good plant if you have a lot of room. Now, this one is Calicarpa rubella, R-U-B-E-L-L-A, and it's an easy one to identify. I'll go back to this one. You see how the leaf tapers down to the leaf stalk, the petiole. But Calicarpa rubella is the only Chinese species of Calicarpa where the leaf base is auriculate. Auriculate is referring to eared, and you see instead of the leaf blade tapering down to the petiole, it sort of goes beyond the petiole and then circles back, so it's sort of ear shape. And that distinguishes it from other Chinese Calicarpas, so it's one that we feel comfortable in identifying. Now, these particular individuals haven't yet colored up. We have other plantings of this species in the garden that are already really well colored, but the really desirable thing about this species is that pretty much all the other Calicarpas we have in the Arboretum will, if the birds don't strip them, the fruit shrivels when we have a hard freeze. So, but Calicarpa rubella, I been in this job 4 years, and there's the 2 oldest plants in the Arboretum. The fruit is showy all winter long. And that's a real distinction between this species and all the other calicarpers I'm familiar with. So Calicarpa rubella is one worth searching out because it'll give you this, this is not a real common fruit color. There's no end of red fruited plants, but this color is pretty unusual in fruiting plants, but you'll have that color all winter long. And these plants, they're in their second year in this location, at least their second year, and I don't see any seedlings coming up at all. Earlier there was the question about calicarpus seeding around.
We actually just had a question about the seeding. Someone was asking if there's cross-pollination going on between the beautyberries. I said it's possible, but I don't know how common it is.
I don't have any more information to add than that, Chris.
There you go.
Yeah. And somebody in the audience will say, he's been carrying this damn flower through the whole program and he hasn't talked about it yet. Well, I was thinking we were going to end up in front of the Farfugiums. The Farfugiums used to be classified with the Ligularias, but are now in a different genus, Farfugium. And they're grown primarily for their foliage. The wild type has a good-sized green, sort of round, slightly heart-shaped leaf. Beautiful, just glossy green foliage. The most common one is one that's dotted with yellow and, with the common name of leopard plant. And they bloom every year, mid-fall and later. But years ago when frost was earlier, you rarely saw them bloom. But now, because frost is many weeks later, they're a reliable floral show in the fall of all time. This is not the typical form. The typical form wouldn't have all these little petals in the center, but just these big ray flowers, so it looks like a big solid yellow daisy. But this particular cultivar is past its best, so it was much prettier, several weeks ago, but it's a really pretty selection called Jitsuko's Jewel, named by a very good horticulture out of Atlanta, Georgia, Ozzie Johnson, who named it for his late wife, Jitsuko, but real beautiful in bloom. Is this the point when you want me to stop wandering around the garden and just answer questions?
It certainly could be.
Okay.
Someone just mentioned that they're saying Thursday night, Friday morning is going to be 31 degrees. We all know what that means, frost coming.
Yeah, bring your houseplants in if you haven't already.
Yes, go ahead.
Most of mine are already in, thank goodness.
Well, Doug follows all of our advice properly.
No, I don't. It's usually at the last minute dash.
I was commenting to Carol, who's over here helping today with her husband Alexander, that I usually run into outside after I watch the weather, and they say, if your plants aren't brought in now, they better be brought in because they're going to be dying tonight. So that's when I bring mine in.
Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, go ahead and ask them in the chat or just unmute yourself to ask a question. I do believe I have captured or answered all of them so far, so there's nothing outstanding.
Okay, so does that mean we continue to wander around the garden, or?
If that's what you want to do, I'm sure you got a captive audience here, but we are at 4:10 p.m.
Oh,
already.
well then, yeah, it's time-ish, yeah.
Time-ish, yeah.
Yeah,
We
years ago, our first frost often was the week of the state fair. And then, there were those occasions where spend the evening at the state fair and dash home and bring all the houseplants in. It was not a pretty scene.
You mentioned yesterday going to the state fair and having a sleep night.
Well, I moved to North Carolina in 1979 and visited the state fair that fall, and it was sleeting that night. Yeah.
And now these days we're upset when they're not all in the 70s, right?
Right. It's often too warm to go to the state fair. I didn't say that. Okay.
So Mary just asked, can you name the Ozzie Johnson Farfugium again? And I was not able to put that one in the chat because for some reason it is not in our online plant records.
It's right outside your office,
I know
Chris.
it is. I've enjoyed it out there for years. So I'm not too sure why it's not.
Well, they're Farfugium, aren't they? Farfugium japonicum.
Yeah.
And it's Jitsuko, which is Jitsuko. Jitsuko's jewel. I think it's jewel and not gem. I'm quite sure it's jewel. And, you know, that's probably something that's occasionally sold by Plant-to-Light's nursery. Some of the Farfugium cultivars can be propagated through tissue culture, so there's never a shortage of them. And I suspect this one probably could be.
How about Jitsuko's star?
Oh, okay. Jitsuko's star. Okay.
Yeah. There we go. And, here was a question. Let me see if I can get back to it. If you're late to bring in the houseplants, any last-minute hitchhiker bug prevention tips?
Oh, I've never found that to be a big problem.
I haven't brought in a whole lot. I always wind up with things like spider mites later on in the year. Yeah, when they go back outside in the spring is when insect problems are often bad, because most insects aren't a big problem outside. It's when they're inside that they go bonkers. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, check out your houseplants ahead of time. Just look for the insect problems before you bring them in. Things like spider mites can be usually washed off readily with just a nice garden hose blast. So you can just blast them, which is nice to do. Just wash them off before you bring them in. Yeah. So no other questions. Looks like everyone's nice and quiet. It was a great tour, Doug. Thank you so much for spending part of your afternoon with us. We appreciate it. Thank you to everyone for joining us online as well. And we look forward to seeing you here in person in our programming, here in the gardens, and of course next week online in our Midweek with Mark program. We'll see you then. Have a great day and a great weekend. Thank you, everybody. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you.